For those of us who live and work here, we know what Monterey Bay means to us. From the beaches to the redwoods, from agricultural fields to historic landmarks, we cherish the beauty of this environment. However, we know that it takes more than appreciation to live and thrive in this region. It takes vision. We envision prosperity for all who live and work in the Santa Cruz, San Benito, and Monterey counties. I'm Tara Garaya, President and CEO of Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, or MBEP for short. Our mission is to improve the economic health and quality of life right here in our backyard. At MBEP, we are laser focused on key initiatives that benefit everyone in the region. The blueprint to success is written in our research papers, mapped out in strategic initiatives, and put into action by leaders like you, who believe in our collective vision of the region, uplifting the stories of the Central Coast. It's a story of hope because our children need reliable internet access to complete their homework at home. It's the story of balance between life and work because people who work here deserve housing here instead of wasting hours in traffic. And it's the story of achievement because local tech companies are providing real opportunities for the most exciting new careers in aeronautics and aerospace engineering. MBEP convenes leaders to the same table, sparking new ideas from intentional and mindful learning. Those ideas evolve into policies that promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility for the entire region. We are your champion for broadband, your neighbor and ally for housing, your advocate in workforce and economic development. We are the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, and we want to be your partner. Join us. Learn more by visiting our website today. Welcome to the 9th Annual Economic Outlook, brought to you by the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership and our wonderful event sponsors, Southwell Ventures, Bay Federal Credit Union, and UC Santa Cruz. My name is Tara Garaya, and I'm the President and CEO of MBEP, and I'm very excited that you could join us today at our 9th Annual Economic Outlook. For those of you who might be new to us this morning, MBEP is a regional member-supported nonprofit organization consisting of public, private, and civic entities located throughout the counties of Monterey, San Benito, and Santa Cruz. Founded in 2015, our mission is to improve the economic health and quality of life in the region. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Like you, I'm excited to hear Dr. Thornberg, and who is no stranger to the Monterey Bay region or to MBEP. I'm eager to hear his expertise on the national and local economies. And as you know, much has occurred in our region since the last time we convened. And there are many top of mind issues for all of us, including myself, about long-term economic recovery from the storms, impact on our ag industry because of the storms, jobs that are family sustaining and well-paying in the region so folks can afford the rising prices of food, not to mention prices of homes. And then we have had several banks fail. What does that mean for economic health and security? And the war abroad continues to escalate, and not to mention the lack of a debt ceiling deal as of just about an hour or so ago. The looming recession, and there's much to think about, much to discuss during these very interesting times. But before Dr. Thornberg shares his forecast, I believe a survey has just popped up. If you could take a moment to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate your feedback. As you're doing that, I invite you also to introduce yourself on the chat. Tell us your name, your organization, and what brings you here today. As we, again, take some time to take the survey, I would now like to pivot and introduce our board chair for Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, Chancellor Cynthia LaRue. She's an absolutely amazing thought partner, leader, and trailblazer on both on and off the UC Santa Cruz campus. Many of you know that she joined the UC Santa Cruz back in 2019 as the 11th chancellor. She is an accomplished and amazing bioanalytical chemist who came to UC Santa Cruz from Riverside and has authored more than 155 publications and personally mentored over 30 doctoral and master's students. I don't know how she does it, but what I do love about her is that she's constantly encouraging the participation and success of women and other underrepresented groups in the STEM fields. And she's definitely committed to student success. She herself is a first-generation college graduate earning her PhD in analytical chemistry from UC Riverside while raising two children, two daughters specifically. So it is my pleasure to hand the program to Chancellor LaRive. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tara, and good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be with you today as the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership Board Chair and excited to collaborate with folks from around our region. Equitable economic development, high quality education and healthcare systems, and protecting the special qualities of the greater Monterey Bay region are not mutually exclusive. I'm thrilled to work together with leaders, businesses, and organizations from throughout our region to advance this vision and ensure our communities thrive. MBEP is proud to be at the center of this collaborative effort to accelerate positive change. This economic summit is annual, but we have other events throughout the year. All the information is on the MBEP website, mbep.biz. You'll also find information there on all our initiatives and how to become a member. Membership fuels our efforts and provides opportunities to advance our agenda and address policy issues important to the Monterey Bay region. Together, we can make a difference. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Christopher Thornberg. A familiar face, Chris joined us in person pre-COVID and has joined us virtually the past few years to help us better understand what was happening economically in the region. Chris founded Beacon Economics in 2006. The firm is one of the most respected research organizations in California, serving public and private sector clients across the United States. In 2015, Dr. Thornberg became director of the Center for Economic Forecasting and Development at the UC Riverside School of Business, and he serves as an adjunct professor at the school. Christopher also serves as chair of the California Chamber of Commerce Economic Advisory Council. He specializes in economic and revenue forecasting, regional economics, economic policy, and labor and real estate markets. Dr. Thornberg holds a PhD in business economics from the Anderson School at UCLA and a BS in business administration from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thornberg.
Good morning, everybody. I know that hang on one second, let me get my presentation up here. Yay, there we go. Awesome. Also, at this point in time, it looks like we have some answers to our quiz. As always, let me kick off appropriately. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here yet again, back with Tara M3, to talk about trends, obviously, big picture stuff, national, local, here in the state of California, of course, right here in the 3-county M3 region. There are lots to talk about today, and they asked if I wanted to do some polling up front, which is exactly what I did. And what we can do, of course, is take a quick look at this. I think it's always good to have an understanding of where we all are on the basis of this. How do you think the economy is doing relative to last year? The answer is pretty much a mixed bag. Interesting. Some people say same, some people say better, some people say worse. How do you think the local economy is doing relative to last year? Most people, I think the local economy is doing relative to last year. I'm not sure about how that question got mixed up. I think yes means better. So we're going to say most people think that things are better. They haven't fallen. 40% people think 40%. Fear of 5% see 43%. Very few you see big declines in home prices. And then last but not least, most of you think that the labor force up there in the last decade has grown by about 5% or 5 to 10%. Very interesting and surprisingly optimistic. This is a good thing. It seems like most of our audience is pretty happy with where the local economy is. Well, let's go ahead and go through some of the numbers that we have up to date. And you'll have to appreciate that sometimes we got some information on what's going on. Sometimes there's a little lag in some of the data, particularly when it comes to agricultural, dealing with some of these issues having to do with storms. But nevertheless, let's go ahead and try to catch up the best we can. And with that, let's dive right in. What I want to do, of course, as always, I'm going to start with the larger economy, U.S. in particular, and boil it right down into the Monterey Bay region. And when it comes to the national economy, well, really, it's been about a year since I've been with you. And over the last year, we have heard pretty much nothing but, yet again, consistent calls for an economic downturn. Nothing particularly new here. We saw something very similar in 2019. We saw something very similar in 2017. In fact, it just seems inevitable that every time any kind of negative data comes out, you're immediately going to have a certain set of economists out there predicting the end is nigh. Now, for those of you who've seen my presentation over the last few years, this is when I roll out miserableism. Miserableism, of course, is the philosophy of pessimism, and it's the term I've used to describe our national and candidly local state of mind over the last decade, which is no matter what the data tells us, let's figure out a way of telling everybody why it's bad news, and away we go. Now, things have changed a little bit in my mind over the last couple of years, and a lot of it has to do with the book I read by Robert Shiller. Robert Shiller, maybe you have heard of him. He wrote a book, a very famous book called Irrational Exuberance about 20 years ago, which had everything to do with what was going on during that dot-com bubble. This is his most recent effort. It's called Narrative Economics. It's a wonderful book. I encourage everybody who likes this kind of stuff to go ahead to Amazon and buy it. But the reason I found this book so enlightening in narrative economics is it really is, if you will, a finger being pointed at the economics community. And what Robert Shiller points out quite rightly is one of the core assumptions at the heart of modern economics is the idea of the rational human being. And while I appreciate at some level people try to be as rational as they can, we nevertheless have to appreciate that, if you will, the human mind is a little bit more complex than the standard mathematical models presented to us in the Chicago School of Thought would have us believe. And in particular, Robert Shiller brings up the point about the importance of the narrative. Now, by the narrative, what's he talking about, of course, is these kind of cultural stories, the things that bind us as a community, that in many ways is at the heart of our ability to, well, coexist within these large communities. It's the core of civilization in so many different ways. And his argument here is the idea that economists can just toss out the narrative and assume everybody's following the data. Well, first of all, it just belies any obvious examination of what's actually going on out there. And of course, it also, if you will, contradicts what we understand about human to human mentality. Now, the reason that narratives become important boils down to this basic idea. When the narrative, that is to say, the stories we're telling each other, is very similar to the economic realities, well, this is when our models work. This is when households are making the appropriate spending and saving decision. This is when businesses are choosing to invest in the right places. This is when our policymakers are pursuing the right goal. But too often, the narrative becomes disconnected from the reality. And this is when things start to get interesting, and I don't mean necessarily interesting in a good way. What we're talking about here is a circumstance where we really start to see improper behavior, policymakers pursuing the wrong goals, households doing the wrong things, businesses investing in the wrong stuff, and of course, well, bad things happen in the economy. Now, over the last decade, I would argue that the difference between narrative and reality is, again, one of miserableism. No matter how good the data tells us things are getting, we continue to tell each other how terrible and tragic everything is. And as a result of that, you're creating, particularly in the world of policy, some really warped objectives, as the case may be. But of course, let's go before the Great Recession, when it really wasn't one of miserableism, but nevertheless, we had this disconnect between narratives and realities. Back then, for example, well, how about in 1998, where if you had a lousy business plan that was never going to make a penny, you slap .com in the end and suddenly it's worth $10 billion. Or a far more dangerous narrative in 2005, that anybody could grab a number of pick-a-pay subprime mortgages from Countrywide and become a real estate millionaire. Yet again, we saw the damage that this broken narrative did to our economy. And as such, we constantly have to be on the lookout for these stories that are roaming around us that, when you look a little closely, clearly aren't true, yet nevertheless seem to have this phenomenal, well, I don't know, root within our collective consciousness, and obviously things that are potentially negative that come out of that situation. Now, with all that in mind, we have to acknowledge that the last year has been, well, there's been some stresses on our economy. It starts, of course, with the big increase in inflation we saw over the course of the last 12 years. There was the big decline, of course, in the consumer confidence metrics. For those of you who study numerology, you probably recognize that we have an inverted yield curve right now. For those of you who are wondering, an inverted yield curve is when long-run interest rates are lower than short-run interest rates. And this has been, over time, a pretty good indication that there's a recession coming. Now, I would argue this is correlation, not causation. Thus, this doesn't really tell us much of anything. But nevertheless, it clearly is indicative of stresses on the economy. Because of the inverted yield curve, by the way, the Conference Board has come out and they have put the recession probability at 99%, which I think is a phenomenal degree of confidence. And yes, then we have some of these banking failures as well. So there's little doubt that, at least from an aggregate standpoint, it looks like there's some big stresses in the economy. But we also have to acknowledge something else, which is coming into 2023. If you just look at the first quarter of this year, it's pretty clear the U.S. economy is nowhere near recession at this particular point in time. If anything, the economy continues to look like it's running at full speed. Take, for example, the unemployment rate, which remains stubbornly at 3.4, 3.5%. This is the lowest unemployment rate we've seen in the nation since the late 1960s, and far beyond anything what we would call full employment. Industrial production continues to run at a near all-time high level. And, you know, even in the first quarter of this year, the headline number for growth was 1.1%. But that number is not a terribly good reading on what's actually going on in the economy, because of the fact that it's measuring change in output. What you really want to see is change in consumption, buying, because that ultimately demand leads supply. So on that note, we have another metric we call final demand. And final demand is simply the sum total of spending by consumers, businesses in the form of investment, and of course the government in the form of the various government services that they provide. Well, final demand grew to 3.25% in the first quarter of this year. And to put that in context, that is the best number we've seen in the US since the second quarter of 2021. So if anything, we came into 2023 with all these, of course, negative shocks to the system, with an economy that seems to be picking up momentum rather than losing it. So again, very odd circumstances, which seems to be a very healthy economy, combined with, of course, all these claims that things are about to dry up and go away. Where are we heading? Well, the standard, of course, message over the last year is we're going to have a recession. Why are we going to have a recession? We'll start with the idea that the economy is already in a crisis. This is the foundational, shall we say, understanding of miserableism. Everything's at a cliff edge. Everything's about to collapse. We're right on the edge of everything falling apart. We've been hearing this for a decade. It's time for us to move on. But man, is that stuck in our craw. But of course, we have to think a little bit about these proximate causes. And the proximate causes, obviously, as already noted, the big increase in inflation. And with the big increase in inflation, we also see the big increase in interest rates. Story, very simple. Inflation is hurting consumers. Interest rates are hurting real estate. Ergo, we're going to have a recession. And the failure of the banks is simply a sign of the underlying rot in the system. Well, this simply isn't the case. If you take a step back and consider what's really going on, start with a basic idea about inflation and interest rates. The way the press kind of views this is as an exogenous shock, right? They just say, well, this just happened. And thus it's a big negative shock to our system. Well, it didn't just happen. Inflation and interest rates are the direct consequences of the excessive stimulus put into place a couple of years ago in response to the pandemic. This was going to happen because of Federal Reserve policy, particularly as in regards to quantitative easing. They put way too much money in the economy. And when you put too much money in the economy, you have inflation, you have interest rates. These aren't negative shocks. These are the outcomes of the choices we've made. For those thinking we're going to have a recession, my question is always, why? You know, to have a recession, what you need to see in our economy is some large material imbalance, some shock to the system, some rapid change in one segment of things, typically, but not always driven by some sort of big imbalance or bubble that built up in the economy. I don't see it. I mean, for all the conversations about things going on, the underlying economy today actually looks phenomenally strong. And I'll get into that in a couple of minutes. Yes, asset prices are coming down, but only because they were pushed up too high back in 2021, again, as a result of the excessive stimulus. The most important thing, of course, is that we expect consumer spending in particular to continue to move forward because the underlying conditions of the consumer today are about as good as they've ever been. And I appreciate that that's not what you're hearing in the shall we say narrative, but that's the reality. And as a result of that, strength in consumer spending and the investment that goes along with continuing to meet that consumer demand will more than be enough to offset weaknesses in real estate and finance. Now, with all that in mind, does that mean everything's fine, hunky-dory, we can go home and be happy? No, we have any number of quite severe issues we need to be focused on. One of them is, for example, the fact that the big increase in interest rates from 2.5% to 7% means, of course, there's been a collapse in what we call filtering. And I'll come back to this idea a little bit when I start talking about housing shortages. Labor shortages across the board are an enormous issue. And yes, they're having a very large impact, particularly here in California and the Monterey Bay region. Public deficit challenges at the federal and, of course, here in the state level. The potential and completely pointless bank credit crisis our economy is going to start suffering from. And last but not least, the gap between the narrative and the reality. The thing that worries me the most about our economy today, very simple, is that we're worrying about problems that aren't really a problem, and that we're not worrying about the problems that are. And until we get an appropriate focus on the stresses as they actually exist in our economy, it's hard to see us pursuing the correct policies in order to continue to the prosperity we've seen in our economy over the last bunch of years. So with all this in mind, how do we get here? Oh, and I should probably point something else out. Over the last year, I've gotten a little bit sophisticated. I have a wonderful new assistant named Kristen who's helping out with my slides, and she's gotten me to the point of using a QR code. So at the very end of this presentation, if you'd like a copy of the slides, you will see a QR code. Get your phone out, have it ready, take a picture of that thing, and you'll be able to get a copy of these slides. So with that, let's dive right in. How do we get here? Yet again, miserableism. It all boils down to the pandemic. And look, there's little doubt that the pandemic was a very serious human circumstance. 7 million people passed. We were stuck inside for a year. A lot of kids lost severe education. None of this was good. But with that in mind, it wasn't a depression-causing event. I mean, the kind of craziness, the negativity you're seeing in these headlines just didn't make any sense. And of course, as we have been saying right from the beginning, yes, this was a very extreme circumstance at the beginning, but while it was the deepest recession we've seen in U.S. economic history, it was also the shortest. And as a result of that, really by the beginning of 2021, we were clearly on a rapid path of recovery. We just needed to wait it out. But don't let reality intrude on a good narrative. As a result, of course, of those incredibly negative headlines, Congress leaped into the forefront and they lobbed an insane amount of cash to the economy, $6 trillion in stimulus. Again, context is helpful. The U.S. economy lost about $1.2 trillion in output and income as a result of the shutdowns. But Congress gave us $6 trillion of stimulus, a deficit-led stimulus, $5 of stimulus for every dollar of lost income, vastly over the top. And as a result, that the economy absolutely exploded, became overheated. And to understand why, well, understand how they managed to spend all that money. They didn't go to the bond markets. There was no way they could have done that. All of debt in the United States in 2019 expanded by $3.5 trillion. Had Congress gone to the bond markets in 2020 and asked for $3 trillion, wouldn't have happened. The bond markets would have blown up. They didn't go to the bond markets. They went to Jerome Powell, who happily supplied $5 trillion of brand new money through the process known as quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing is not a new tool. Ben Bernanke famously did it in response to the Great Recession. But you got to understand the difference between now and then. The Great Recession was an enormous shock to the overall U.S. economy. And most important, the collapse of the subprime bubble was inherently deflationary. Ben Bernanke had to resort to the extreme of a quantitative easing to deal with those deflationary effects to prevent the Great Recession from turning into yet another depression. But this time around, the shock was never that bad. Remember how fast the economy came back. Therefore, we didn't need all this cash being thrown at the economy. But Jerome Powell did it anyway. And as a result of that, he set off the single largest short-run expansion of the money supply the U.S. economy has ever seen. Now, what happens when you do this? Well, you've seen it play out over the last couple of years. The first thing that kicks in is money illusion. Everybody feels rich. What do you do when you're rich? You spend and you invest. And next thing you know, interest rates go down, asset prices go up, people start spending more, and everybody feels great. Problem is, it's an illusion. Money does not create more real output, more real services. Only thing this cash has done is push demand beyond the capacity for the economy to meet that demand. And when there's more demand than there is supply, we know what happens. Prices have to go up. Bam, next thing you know, the hangover kicks in. As a result of the excessive amount of demand in the economy, inflation kicks in, interest rates start to go up, asset prices sag back, and ultimately the economy goes right back to where it started. In other words, nothing has changed from the long run. But Milton Friedman, who famously wrote the book Money Mischief, points out quite clearly that, look, there is long-run harm involved here, largely because a big surge in inflation transfers a bunch of wealth from savers to borrowers, and it also increases financial risk. You haven't changed anything in the short run. You have created long-run problems for the economy. This is why I coined his book Money Mischief. This is something we should avoid. We shouldn't do it. This is why we should have a Federal Reserve that's politically independent. Of course, the Federal Reserve is no longer politically independent. And guess what? We did it. And boy, this is exactly what you've seen over the last couple of years. Now, this is not the first wealth bubble our nation has seen. In fact, it's the third. The first wealth bubble we saw was back in the late 1990s. That, of course, was .com. And then we saw the subprime wealth bubble. And now, of course, we have the quantitative easing wealth bubble. This is all data on the left-hand side, which is household growth and household net worth. This whole system operates through the wealth effect. The big difference between these three wealth bubbles in the economy is who benefited and, of course, who was hurt. If you think about .com, for example, that was all the games of the top 10%. The bottom 90% hardly saw anything happen because they weren't privy to IPOs and a bunch of tech stocks. Subprime was particularly bad for the bottom 50% because these, in many cases, is the bottom 50% of our population that got those subprime loans and then were foreclosed on, and then they ended up substantially worse off. This time around, the quantitative easing wealth bubble was actually progressive. Take a look at the right-hand side and look at the sharper increases in net worth for the bottom 50%. In fact, in some ways, while obviously it's created some issues from a long-run perspective for the economy, if we wanted to see some, shall we say, redistribution from a wealth perspective, well, what Jerome Powell did over the last couple of years certainly helped out on that particular front. But because of putting all that cash into the bottom 50%, one of the things that's popped out is, of course, is a much quicker inflationary response. Look, you give a guy like Elon Musk $100 million and, it's margin of error on his checking account. You put that $100 million into the bottom 50%, and it very quickly turns into consumer demand, which very quickly turns into inflation when, of course, the economy isn't able to meet that demand. And that's exactly what happened. Over the course of the last year, a big surge in inflation, up to 9% year over year for the CPI, the PCE, which is more appropriate, up about 7%. And with the big increase in inflation, interest rates have started to come up. And again, here we go with the hangover period. What's interesting about this is not what happened. Everything I just told you was completely obvious. If you ever, any student of monetary history, you know this. What's shocking is how we're not talking about it appropriately. Think about some of these conversations you've heard in DC. Why do we have inflation? Oh, it's supply chains. It's the federal deficit. It's greedy corporations. Not enough manufacturing jobs, green energy policies, rising wages. Now everybody, Republicans and Democrats, can agree it's Putin's fault. Well, none of these things are true. All these things are just the same as saying inflation's because of the Rams' horrible front line or because Elon Musk can't get his rocket up. Look, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Why can't they just acknowledge this? Why do they have to come up with these silly excuses? Well, remember, in a world of miserableism, you can't acknowledge what's going on. In a world of miserableism, 80% of consumers are living hand to mouth and are one paycheck away from being homeless. If you stand up and say, hey, it's a monetary phenomenon. What you're saying inherently is the reason we have inflation is people are trying to spend too much money. And that doesn't work with the miserablest narrative. Hence, we do this ridiculous dance talking about things that are absolutely false when it comes to this inflationary surge. And you can see that no better than what happened with gasoline prices. I remember, oh boy, a year ago when gasoline prices went up 50% and everybody was all hot and bothered. And we all saw all sorts of stories about how tragic this was for the US population. Yet, before we go to this idea that this was caused by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and therefore is having a terrible impact on American drivers, let's see something in mind. If this was just a supply effect and prices went up by 50%, well, what would you expect? Well, in the old supply and demand world, supply goes up, prices go up, and the quantity consumed goes down. Well, if you take a look at the back here, these are vehicle miles driven in the United States. And one of the things you should immediately appreciate, a 50% increase in overall gasoline prices led to no change in vehicle miles driven. In other words, this wasn't about a big hit to consumers. This was a function of excessive demand for gasoline because, hey, we all wanted to drive. And we all remember those stories where the TV gentleman would walk up to this guy in the gas station and they'd say, hey, how do you feel about filling up your tank? And he'd start rambling and complaining. And it would just be this complaining that people would assume means, hey, this is really bad for the economy. What always made me crazy is I never asked this gentleman the next obvious question as he was filling up his car, which is, where are you going? Well, me and the boys are taking the new boat out to the lake. That's exactly what's been going on. People are not suffering because of high prices. They're upset because of high prices. That is to say, they feel like they have a bunch of money. They want to go out and spend money, particularly after being stuck inside for a year, and they're finding the prices of everything are up. That's upsetting to them, but prices are up because everybody's trying to do the same thing. And what's intriguing is, remember the governor's response to this last year. He sent out, of course, rebate checks for our troubles because of those high gasoline prices. Well, gasoline prices were high because the Federal Reserve gave the economy, put too much brand new cash into the economy, giving people more money to deal with the problem of too much money. Well, obviously, this is when you can start to see how a broken narrative can lead to extreme wrong versions of policy reactions, as simple as that. Again, it has not been a bad year for consumers. Just look at some of the data for 2022. 2022, we had a record high year for real spending on alcohol. Las Vegas gaming revenues have never been higher without the return of the Chinese whales. It's really hard to look at data like this and think in the aggregate that consumers are suffering. Now, look, there's no doubt that there are a group of people out there that are falling behind. There are obviously shifts. There are winners and losers in an inflationary environment. But on net, the winners, of course, are doing substantially worse than people are falling behind on the other side of it. And even when it comes back to the first quarter of this year, personal consumption added about 2.5% to that 3.25% growth in final demand. Consumer spending looks remarkably strong coming into this year. And you can see it in other ways. For example, spending in restaurants right now is 40% higher than it was before the pandemic. Now, it doesn't mean restaurants are doing great. Most restaurants will tell you that their costs are going up equivalent with demand. But this goes back to how strong the consumer is. They're out there still going in restaurants, despite, of course, the big increase in prices, and they don't care. They want to have fun. Global travel is back to where it was pre-pandemic. People are traveling abroad. By the way, folks haven't come back as much. In fact, foreign visitors coming to the United States is still down about a third from where it was pre-pandemic. And this is one of the reasons why tourism has cooled off a bit. Americans are going abroad, but again, folks from abroad are not coming back into our economy yet. They will start coming. Even on the auto front, we know we had a bad year for auto sales last year, but it wasn't because of a lack of demand, it's because of a lack of supply. We still have just 100,000 cars in inventory. Contrast that to 5 years ago when we had 1 million cars in inventories of new cars for sale in the United States. We continue to exist in a world where consumers continue to be denied consumption opportunities simply because industry can't keep up. And if you take a look locally, there's little doubt that things have cooled off a little bit over the course of the last 6 months or so in the Monterey Bay region. You could see for example, taxable sales have cooled off just a bit in the three-county region, but they're still substantially higher than they were back in 2019. You look at the hotel data, again, things have cooled off. Remember, we're not doing the in-state vacations. We're not going abroad again. You are starting to see some declines in occupancy rates in the Central Coast region, but let's keep in mind that rates really haven't come down much. ADRs are still better than they were a number of years ago. So the hotels are seeing a cooling off, but it's a plateau, not, if you will, some sort of implosion after the gains they've seen over the last couple of years. And I appreciate that some of this is probably surprising. We've heard a lot about how consumers are being hurt by inflation, but we've really only had 1 year of inflation after, of course, 4 years of relatively low inflation. This is not the kind of inflation we saw, say, back in the 1970s, where after 5 years, Americans had seen a 50% increase in prices. This time around in 5 years, just about 18%. It's not as dramatic as people would have you believe. The increase in interest rates we've seen, most American debt is in the form of a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, which of course, well, current interest rates have nothing to do with that monthly payment. And as a result of that, the financial obligations ratio is still quite low. Now, for those continuing to predict the consumer's about to, shall we say, dry up and blow away, they will point to, of course, the savings rate being down to 2%, the disposable income, real disposable income back down to the 2020 levels because, of course, that increase in inflation. But this is nothing to do with income. This is a wealth effect. You know, we got some revised data, and it looks like at the end of last year, American households still had $30 trillion more in the way of wealth than they did prior to the pandemic because, again, that asset bubble. And to be clear, that's about 20% higher. Now, not all wealth is, shall we say, equal when it comes to a demand effect. Some wealth is better, is more directly impactful than others. Stock market, for example, does not have a big wealth effect because the stock market is held by the top 1%, by various corporations. And for a lot of folks, so that stock market is in their 401k. You got to put all that to one side. That's not real money at some level. What's real money? Well, how about cash in your checking account, savings account, and, you know, stuck in a box under your bed? If you look at cash on hand, checkable deposits for American households, prior to the pandemic, it was about 1.1 trillion. Today, it's 4.7 trillion. Yeah, let that roll around. 4.7 trillion, 3 trillion more, and just 3.5 trillion more cash on hand than people had 3.5 years ago. That's an insane amount of cash liquidity. And again, who's holding on to it? It's not the top 1%. The bottom 50% are hanging on to 100% more liquid cash. 50 to 90th percentile, 130% more cash. There's tons of cash. It's cash that's driving consumer demand, and it's consumer demand that continues to push the economy forward despite inflation, despite the increase in interest rates. What about consumer debt? You keep hearing scary stories about, for example, credit card debt. Look, take a look on the left-hand side. Bankruptcies, foreclosures, still at record low level in the U.S. economy. Credit card debt is growing, but only after sharply falling in the first year and a half of this particular pandemic. We're not back to the pre-pandemic line we were on. Overall, credit card debt still remains remarkably clean when you look at, for example, transitions into delinquency. Businesses continue to do well as well. Profits continue to rise. The bond markets look just fine. Again, outside of scary headlines, it's remarkable how solid our economy looks. How about in the Monterey Bay region? Again, an interesting mix. This is a GDP data. I've aggregated it, had to do a little finagling to deal with some missing data, but this is a decent estimate of what's going on in the the 3 region. And it's interesting, if you look from 2017 to 2021, over about a 4-year period, the overall region's economy grew by about 10%, about 2.5% per year. Not bad. Now, where did most of that come from? Well, again, very exciting was manufacturing. Manufacturing added almost 60% to overall economic output. Real estate's been doing all right, professional services. These are good numbers. Now, there are some negatives. Retail trade's cooled off a bit, construction's cooled off a bit. The big head, of course, has been the agriculture. Agriculture has absolutely been struggling in Monterey for a number of years now in real terms. First, it was the drought. Now it's too much water. Obviously, we've had the storms. But one of the things that's helpful on that particular front has to do with the fact that while real output has come down, overall nominal GDP for agricultural has remained steady. In other words, there's been enough increase in prices to offset, if you will, some of those declines in real outputs. And at least you can say, from an income perspective, the industry hasn't been a big drain. It just hasn't been adding a lot. And again, a little bit dated at this point in time. You continue to see good numbers: lettuce, strawberries, broccoli, celery, these high value crops that grow so well in that Monterey Bay region, doing quite well. And, even coming into the end of this year, it's interesting. We've actually seen a lot of jobs being added to Monterey Bay in the ag industry. So all of a sudden, while things have been weak, there has been a little bit of a bounce back. Yes, the storms hit a resurgent economy. Question, will they be able to bounce back? My feeling is they will be. There's a tremendous amount of demand for food. Yes, they need some help getting things cleaned up and rebuilt, but you're starting to see ag come back again. This is good news for 2024. Wine, obviously, another kind of situation. Businesses will tell you our problem isn't demand. It's fine, whether we're a hotel, whether we're a restaurant, whether we're a farm. Our problem is not demand, it's manpower. And we have seen some cooling off in the labor markets. Right now, the job opening rate in the U.S. has dropped below 6%. It was above 7%. Clearly, things are cooling off. But let's keep something in mind. Prior to the pandemic, the highest job openings rate this nation ever seen was about 4.8%. So there's still way more job openings than there are people actually looking for work. And that is what's keeping our labor markets incredibly tight. Why are we short people? Well, demographics. I've had this conversation before. Boomers, out of families of 12 kids, all had one kid. Now, every time a boomer retires, you have one Gen Z coming into the workforce. Look, this was going to happen. Demographers have been saying it for decades. But what's made it immediate, what's made it right now, of course, had to do with what happened during the pandemic. Not so much as the pandemic, shall we say, created a negative shock to our labor force. Quite the opposite. It created a positive shock, in as much as a big increase in asset values encouraged a couple million people to say, it's time for me to go ahead and retire. And they dropped out of the labor force. So it was a surge of retirement that created these labor shortages, and away we go. Now, it's a two-edged sword. One of the big upsides of course, a tight labor market has to do with the fact that workers' earnings are going up. And by the way, tight labor markets are particularly beneficial for lower skilled, lower pay workers. Take a look at the left-hand side. This is data that comes from the Atlanta Fed. It's the wage tracker, and they actually break it down by earnings level. And it's interesting. You probably didn't know this, but the bottom half of earners started earning more than the top half of earners starting roughly 2015. That's right. We've had 8 years of declining income inequality. Declining, not rising, but declining, which of course you have not heard. By the way, over the last 3 years, the pace of declining in income inequality has never been more rapid than it is right now. This is inflation adjusted terms. And over the last year, for example, the bottom 50% of earners saw their real earnings go up by 2%. That's inflation adjusted. Whereas the top 50%, well, their earnings growth was 0% inflation adjusted after a period of decline. Now, again, I'm not worried about the top 50%. They're just fine. But we can, of course, celebrate the fact that you are seeing better conditions in the bottom half of earners, not for everybody, but for enough of these people that the overall average is being pushed up. Now, I said this is a two-edged sword. What's the other side of it? Well, that, of course, has to do with the fact that business compensation costs are going up. Now, there's an upside to this, and that's particularly important for California. Labor shortages cause businesses to have to invest in capital. And yes, we've seen a good resurgence in business investment, software, research and development, information processing equipment. By the way, this is stuff that the broader Bay Area makes. Ergo, good news for the overall California economy as they, of course, help to deal with this. In some terms of venture capital in the Monterey Bay area directly, decent year there. You see on the right-hand side, some of these companies that are spending money, investing in money there. Interesting, a lot of this, yet again, is in manufacturing. Who's ahead, who's behind from an aggregate perspective? Completely irrelevant question. What's interesting about labor shortages is they are everywhere in the United States. It doesn't matter what state you look at, rural, urban, red, blue, coastal, or inland. every state has an increase in help wanted signs. The only real difference here has to do with, well, who has greatest labor force growth. If you took a look at, for example, jobs in some of the West Coast states, you'll see that California has bounced back the slowest, Oregon the next, and then, of course, Nevada and Arizona are way out in front. But take a look at job openings. Job openings in all four places are substantially elevated. In other words, the conversation here about job growth is not about who has the hottest economy, who has the most labor demand, but rather who has the greatest supply of new workers. And that is where, of course, California continues to not do very well. In fact, labor force in California is just getting back kind of close to where it was pre-pandemic. But suddenly we have a huge problem because unemployment is back to record low levels in the state. There's simply no one left to hire, and this is starting to have a dramatic impact. Now, is it going to get better? I don't think so, for one particular reason. Take a look on the right-hand side. Population is starting to decline in California. We've all heard the news on this particular front. People are leaving, which means our labor force constraints are going to be getting that much worse. We have to think about how this state can grow its labor force. Now, when you think about it regionally, it's a very similar sort of picture. Stockton, the Inland Empire, Fresno, Sacramento, Bakersfield, these are the economies that come back the fastest. What do these economies all have in common? Well, again, labor force growth. Santa Rosa, Los Angeles, Ventura, Oakland has not. What do they lack? Well, again, labor force. If you have labor force growth, if you didn't see all those retirements, if you had people moving into your area over the last couple of years, well, these are the economies that are starting to add. And if you take a look at jobs in the Monterey Bay area, this is the three-county region, they're just back to 250,000. They're just back to where they were pre-pandemic. Yet again, some of the big numbers, manufacturing is doing very well, professional business services, good solid numbers, but the biggest problem yet again, take a look where unemployment is, back down to close to record low levels in all three things. And this almost goes back to the conversation you're getting about labor force availability. Labor force has simply not been growing very rapidly in the three-county region. This is a function of housing shortage. We all know that. Lots of people would love to live there, but they're simply not able to find housing. Ergo, the labor force has been really quite flat over the last 5, 6, 7 years. That's an answer to one of those questions. We did see a little burst of labor force growth in Monterey County specifically around the city of Salinas. That's my read on it at this point in time. But I got to tell you, you got to be a little wary about these short-run increases. I'm not sure what's driving it, but clearly, it's relatively good news. Oh, and by the way, one of the big things here, I always get asked questions about undocumented workers. And in theory, undocumented workers, of course, are counted in these labor force statistics. These statistics have nothing to do with your citizenship status. But at the same time, we also know a lot of undocumented workers, shall we say, understandably, dodge and avoid survey takers like nobody's business. I'm to understand, and M3 is doing some work on getting a better count on this. Heartily recommend it. It's a better sense of what's going on. But at least according to the official statistics, labor force growth has been paltry, which of course is putting some basic stress on the economy, at least from an overall growth perspective. The upside, yet again, is the quality of life among the local population has never been better. Take a look on the left-hand side. This is the share of the population with a subprime credit score. Let's grab, Monterey County. Back in 2014, almost 30% of the population in Monterey County had a subprime credit score. Today, it's below 20%. In the right-hand side, this is median weekly wages. This is according to BLS statistics. And again, you can see just about 2016, 2017, that's when you see these sharp increases. Remember, these are lower skilled, lower earnings workers who are suddenly seeing better economic opportunity. Again, it's really a very good time. Here's some data, again, going back to the American Community Survey. We only have 21 data. The 22 will come out in September. But even here, if you look at 5-year changes in earnings by level of education, who's been seeing the greatest increases in earnings up in the region, all three counties? Well, it's people with a high school degree or less than a high school degree. So you are seeing a shift in economic opportunity from the top to the bottom of the earnings pool. We have a ways to go. There's no doubt about it. One of the ways to think about this is very simple. In a lot of ways, in a lot of cases, we see policy here in California, which is being rushed forward without sufficient consideration of what are the unintended consequences. Is this actually going to help our economy? And those who are rushing it forward often do so on the basis of an almost panic type situation. It's a crisis. We're on the edge. Things are getting worse. We have to help before everything blows up. No. In the aggregate, the trends are better. In the aggregate, the bottom half, the bottom 50% are actually doing better than the top 50%. Overall trends are doing well. We have obviously still a lot of work to do with those families that are falling behind, but in general, it's not a crisis. The situation overall is getting better. Hence, we should take a step back, proceed slowly, and make sure the policies we put into place really do have the responses we want to see. And of course, it gets down to the broader idea, how are we going to expand our labor force growth? Well, the simplest way, of course, boils down to more housing and more workers. We can also increase local participation rates. The easiest way to do that, of course, is to exploit an enormous source of highly skilled, highly motivated labor known as women. And of course, investing in pre-K education to help more women continue their careers, even through, of course, those difficult years of having young children. Well, this is something that the state should be heavily investing in. Productivity enhancements, that's all those capital investments we talked about. And now more than ever, worker skill training. 15 years ago, in the wake of the Great Recession, had you done training for very low skilled workers, it probably wouldn't have helped, because people who had lost their job, had good work experience, were going to get the first crack. Well, not today. In an era of labor shortages, people who would typically not have opportunities have opportunities, but they have to have the training to take advantage of those opportunities. Take I don't know, maybe an undocumented worker who may be cleaning hotel rooms. Well, you give a person like that enough training to become a manager, a frontline manager. Again, just a little bit of training goes a long way. Now more than ever, we really need to be investing in worker training, because this is, again, how you lift things up. The real California story, of course, has been the lack of house building. On the right-hand side, we always constantly hear about comparisons between Texas and California. The Texas-California story can boil down to one thing and one thing only, and that, of course, is they build housing and we don't, and we really need to be building more of it. And the way to think about that is, I showed you a graph a little while ago where I showed the population in California is falling. Now, I want to take on the narrative, because the narrative wrapped around that statistic is people are fleeing the state. They're fleeing high housing costs. They're fleeing taxes. They're fleeing regulation. They are running away. But take a look at the left-hand side of this particular graph. This is housing vacancy rates in California, which, by the way, in 2022, they're about the lowest they have ever been. So how can you have population declines, even as if people are fleeing, housing vacancy rates should be going up? How can you have population declines and yet housing markets are becoming tighter with fewer units? There's only one of two ways that can happen. One is somehow or other we lost a bunch of housing stock, which hasn't happened. Ergo, it must be something else. And that, of course, goes back to the incredible increase in demand. Look, when you say there's more consumer demand, there's more consumer demand for houses, for food, for going to restaurants, for going abroad, for flying places. But there's also more demand for housing. And we often think of demand for housing as, I want a bigger house, I want a bigger apartment. It doesn't just work like that. In fact, there's a whole other part of this, which when there's an increase in demand for housing, often you see fissions within our households. Two roommates living together, they don't want to live that together. Think about two maybe lower earning families that are renting a house together. Well, again, they're doing better. They don't want to live with two families in a house, and they split off. The net result of this, of course, is you end up absorbing space, but because there's so little space available, somewhere down the chain, somebody else gets forced out. Where do they get forced out? Well, they may be leaving the state. Those are the population declines, or they may be forced into the streets. That's homelessness. Again, the narrative about homelessness is that renters are suffering, ergo we have homelessness. No, renters are doing great overall, and that's what's causing homelessness. It's pushing people into the street because we're simply not building enough. And this is exactly what you see in Monterey Bay. Take a look on the right-hand side. This is housing stock data for the Monterey Bay region. It's been growing, it has been declining. The population overall is declining. Yet again, what you see is an increase in housing demand It is literally pushing people out. The only way you can meet this, by the way, you can't fix this by increasing housing demand, subsidizing folks, rent control. All of this does is simply increase overall renter demand even more and pushes more people out. The only way you can deal with this is supply, supply, supply. And boy, supply is needed now more than ever because there's a whole other conversation about what's going on the other side of the hill, up in the Bay Area, where yet again, they're fully recovered, their labor force isn't growing, and yes, they're going to start reaching externally to try and get more workers into those businesses from surrounding areas, including, of course, that crew of people who go up to 17 on a daily basis. So with all that in mind, where's the housing market? Well, there's little doubt that housing markets have cooled off pretty substantially. What's amazing for all the increase in mortgage rates is how this market has already settled out. Median prices in the United States are around just a little bit, but they've already settled up. New housing, of course, we saw a big surge in inventories in new housing, but those inventories are going away. Housing starts are staying relatively strong. Look, what happened in housing is very simple. It's a big sticker shock. Prices went up like nobody's business for 2 years, 61% in Miami, 34% in Boston, San Francisco area, only 35%, middle of the road. But that's 2 years, an incredible increase in prices. Then interest rates went up, the annual mortgage payment went up, and the home market cooled off. But it's not melting down. The fundamentals are too good, too much equity. The mortgage records remain remarkably clean. There are no foreclosures. The real issue, of course, is that we had this big shock to the system of rising interest rates in a housing market that was insanely tight on supply. In real terms, there's been very little built over the last decade, probably because of miserabilism. And the net result is we have an incredibly tight market. Now, this goes back to the idea I talked about before, about the idea about housing markets are supplied. Here's another broken narrative. The statement, we have a shortage of affordable housing. That's completely wrong. We don't have a shortage of affordable housing. We have a shortage of housing, and that impacts affordability. Yet again, those words are very important because too often we push back on housing supply. Oh, you're going to build a big fancy house or a nice apartment building. Well, that's not affordable. We shouldn't build that. It doesn't work that way. Filtering. You build at the top to supply at the bottom. You build a nice place, people move up, these people move here, these people move here. You build at the top, supply at the bottom. By the way, if you don't believe in filtering, ask yourself a question. Do you believe in gentrification? Because gentrification is the opposite process. When you don't build on the top, those higher income families that are going to live in the area because they've determined it will simply gentrify a working class neighborhood. What we need to do here, yet again, is supply, supply, supply. And the big problem here is people aren't moving. They have locked in on that interest rate. They really have no interest in going anyplace. And as a result of that, the filtering process is cooling off, and it becomes harder to deliver any kind of product to the local economy. Now, you can look in the region, it's very clear. Median prices have already started to settle out. These are asking prices, not actual prices. This has come through the multiple listing services. Inventories are tightening up. In other words, the market has cooled off, but it's done. It's already kind of finished up. It's already settling out because, again, no one needs to sell. They're going to sit on their house. This also explains, of course, the strength in the rental markets we've seen. Rental markets are incredibly hot. Rents are up. But remember, while rents are up, vacancy rates are down. Yet again, there's this common story in the paper that somehow the rents are up and that's bad for renters. That's wrong. Rents are driven by it's an equilibrium between supply and demand. If you see a big increase in rents, it either means a decrease in supply, we haven't seen that, or there's an increase in demand. So why rents are going up? Well, because there's a demand for rental places, and that's because a large portion of our renting population is doing great. And you certainly see that there. I mean, Santa Cruz has a 1% vacancy rate in apartments, Monterey 2%. These are too tight. The area desperately needs, particularly multifamily space more than anything else. What we can say right now is that, yes, multifamily is coming up, but it's still vastly too weak. We're not seeing enough. There's some payoff in efforts, but we need to do a lot more to get more housing built. It's not affordability, it's supply. And one of the good bits I saw in Monterey Bay, this is some data coming up. And yes, better numbers in 2022. In fact, the best number for new permits in a decade, but still less than 2,000. particularly when you think about the increased demand for housing, the declines in population, the demands in housing from those potential, of course, commuters, and you recognize that all these wonderful trends you're seeing in manufacturing, professional services could be threatened by nothing more than not building enough, particularly multifamily. This is what needs to happen. And yet again, if you take a look at the data, you look at rent burdens, believe it or not, in Santa Cruz County, the city of Salinas, the share of people spending over 30% of their income has actually fallen. However, the share of people spending over 50% has gone up. Again, the bulk of renters are doing much better, and that's putting pressure on a subset of renters, and that's leading either to people leaving the state or, of course, adding to our homelessness crisis. You have to deal with this with supply, and I appreciate in that many cases that is the hardest way to deal with it, but honestly, it's the only way of dealing with it. Now, on the other side of things, very quickly, we have the Main Street, Wall Street situation. We know commercial is having some issues, particularly on the office front. Worth noting, over the last year, non-res construction spending has actually come up. Turns out, not clearly as negative as you think. Industrial's doing well. Retail is the same as it has been. Only the commodity office spaces are doing well. And look, even locally, take a look at non-res permits, particularly in Santa Cruz County. Good, solid numbers. The area is clearly seeing more investment. Good news all the way around. Where, of course, are the stresses then? Everything I just told you said, the economy is fine with the exception of a lack of labor. Simple as that. But I am worried about the next year. And yet again, it goes back to problems with the narrative. And in particular, the ongoing worries about inflation. Look, we're not done with inflation. We have more to go. Why? Because again, remember, inflation is caused by excessive increase in the money supply. We've only burned off about half of that new money supply. We got a ways to go. What has the Federal Reserve done about this? Their primary tool up to now has been raising the federal funds rate. It's now above 5%. The markets seem to believe that this is going to work. But to be clear, the money supply drives inflation. Increasing the federal funds rate, at best, a second order effect. It doesn't actually change the amount of inflation because it has a very, very limited impact on money supply. It only changes the pace of price adjustment, not where you ultimately go. If you really want to cool off inflation, what you need to do, of course, is you got to cash out. And the reason how you do that, of course, is quantitative tightening. And yes, after cranking up the federal funds rate, they began to indulge in quantitative tightening. After increasing the money supply by 40%, they've managed to shrink it by about 4%. But here's why that's not going to work. See, the big issue here all boils down to what happened to that $5 trillion. The $5 trillion in brand new cash, no matter who they gave it to and what they spent it on, inevitably ended up in a bank. So that $5 trillion of quantitative easing turned into $5 trillion overall deposit, brand new deposits. And what do they do with those deposits? Well, they increase their purchase of securities. They obviously increase loans. They did exactly what they're supposed to do under the regulations given to them by the Federal Reserve. Now, let's think about what happened in terms of banking over the course of the last couple of months. We obviously know about Silicon Valley Bank going belly up. First, what do you call it? The other one up in the Bay, San Francisco, it escapes me. Also went bankrupt. Also get closed down and taken over as well. What's going on in banking? Well, I can tell you what's not going on in banking, and that has been a collapse in underwriting standards. If you look at the far left, the bank charge-off rate right now is still near a record low level. It's not a bad debt problem. Well, what is a problem? Well, the answer is Federal Reserve policy. Here's the big issue. When they put those $5 trillion into the economy, it ended up as bank deposits. The banks bought assets at high prices, securities. They made loans at high prices, otherwise known as low interest rate. That's all fine and good, but suddenly we're at the back end of that. The Federal Reserve cranks up the federal funds rate, and the value of those securities and loans goes down. That would put pressure on the banking system, except they don't have to acknowledge those particular losses. Well, they don't have to unless, of course, the Federal Reserve engages in quantitative tightening, which forces, of course, deposits down because it's the exact opposite of quantitative easing, and they are forced to sell off those securities. This is exactly what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. Their deposits went from 80 billion to 180 billion. They put that into a bunch of debt and a bunch of securities. The value of the securities then fell. The Federal Reserve started quantitative tightening. Their deposit base started shrinking, and they were between the proverbial rock and a hard place. They didn't do anything wrong. They were simply subject to the insanity of Fed policy. The Fed's goals are price stability, full employment, and of course, being the shepherd of the banking system. These goals are not necessarily aligned. You have to proceed cautiously to make sure that doing more of one doesn't hurt one of your other goals. Well, this Federal Reserve doesn't seem to understand what they're doing at all. In a ridiculous panic over full employment, they blew up price stability. In a ridiculous panic over price stability, they're now hurting the banking system. And yes, when you think about what's going on in banking, this is my big worry about where our economy goes. The fact is bank credit is becoming extremely tight right now. There's going to be a lot of folks who are going to go into the local bank, say, I want debt money. And the banker's going to say, no, it's not you. Don't take it personally. The bank doesn't have the cash to see you. And what this means is there's a whole other increase in interest rates because they're going to continue quantitative tightening. The long-run rates are going to go back up. This is what you should worry about, the unwinding of the yield curve as the 10-year bond rate yet again goes up and brings mortgage rates up for it. So everything is fine right now, except for the fact that we have some residual inflation, with the exception of the fact that because of that residual inflation, the Federal Reserve seems intent on hurting our economy. So we also have to layer on top of that the federal situation, the debt ceiling debate, which is ridiculous. And yet here we are. It seems like they're going to go home without a deal. We have Newsom's $32 billion deficit, which was incredibly obvious. So we have all these stressors on top of it. And when you start to realize is, well, the economy's fine, except for terrible policy. It's the problems we have in our economy today is driven by our political leaders running around trying to fix problems that aren't problems, and in turn, they're creating problems. Look, consumer demand is still hot. It can support the economy. Asset prices are too high, but even as they come down, the flows remain solid. The Central Coast's only major issue, as I've already told you, is labor and housing shortages. That's long-run issues, obviously some of the short-run policies. Now, where does the economy go? The Federal Reserve sits on their hands and stops the nonsense. The economy is just going to continue to grow, right? Just let it go. And that's the obvious thing to do. We have a little bit of inflation left, but again, the inflation horse is out of the barn. We need to continue to deal with those who are being negatively impacted by it. The good news is it's a remarkably small share of the population. We can deal with that challenge relatively well, let things burn out. But of course, we are 18 months from a negative election, and that negative election, that narrative is everything. We know the party not in the White House is going to go on and on and on about inflation, and hence Jerome Powell is going to be under phenomenal pressure to stop inflation, which means more quantitative tightening, which means higher long-run interest rates and more bank failures. We don't need this, but it seems like they're going to go there. Now, with all that in mind, where is the Central Coast? Where is the Monterey Bay region? Well, as noted, great trends in terms of industrial structure. Ag seems to be starting to bounce back. The drought, at least for now, is largely behind us. Housing market is starting to stabilize. The bottom 50% of earners are doing wonderfully, obviously outside of a small subset of folks. The problems here are not the problems you were hearing in the press on a day-to-day basis. Yet therein lies the issue, right? The difference between the narrative and the reality. Mark Twain, it's easier to fool people than convince them they have been fooled. Very true. Perhaps even more scary and true. John F. Kennedy. The great enemy of the truth is not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. The myths, the miserablest myths in our economy today continue to distract us and deflect us from where we really need to be focused in terms of pursuing certain policy. We need to get beyond this and remember that to get beyond this, well, that's a function of us. You know, we love to poke at politicians and say, hey, you're the problem. Not at all. Politicians, of course, win or lose on the basis of grabbing the right narrative. If they're carrying forward a particular narrative, this is the narrative they ran with when they were elected to office. It comes from us. We have to be the source of pushing the narrative back to the reality and pursuing those correct goals. So my ask of you is avoid the weapons of mass distraction. Don't let those screaming headlines get into your head. Recognize the underlying data is significantly different and appreciate the best way that we can proceed forward to make sure things continue to be successful and wonderful, particularly in the Monterey Bay region, is, of course, to make sure that the narrative and the reality fit well together. And with that, I'm a little over, but here's my QR code. I'm going to let that sit up there for just a couple seconds. And Tara, do we have some time for Q&A, given where we are time-wise?
Yes, we do. Again, thanks, Chris, for, as usual, a very informative, insightful presentation with much to unpack. I guess the question is, where do we begin? I know folks have a lot of really great questions, and let me pull some up. So we'll spend the next 10 minutes or so on some of the questions that have been raised. You kept saying supply, supply, supply. I'm just curious right off the bat, before we delve into a whole host of questions that have generated, what are your policy recommendations, both at the local level and what we should be sort of leaning in at the state level in terms of policy shifts to increase that supply and increase housing for all across all income levels? What would that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, look, we have to appreciate when it comes to housing, it's been death by 1,000 cuts, right? I mean, it's this and that and that and this, whether it's zoning or whether it's CEQA or whether it's these planning boards and the inconsistency. You know, I just saw a study about LA not too long ago. You know how long it takes to get a permit pulled in LA City? 4 years. And by the way, that's if you actually get it pulled after 4 years of fighting with the city. So we start building in these phenomenal hurdles just to get to the process of putting the first stick in the ground. And then you're dealing with a whole other host of issues, from permit fees and lack of labor and everything else. What we need to do is figure out how to speed up the permitting process, make it a hell of a lot more certain. And yeah, that means at some level, changing, if you will, some of the zoning rules. If you look at places that have been very successful in expanding the housing supply rapidly, very often what they end up doing is doing a bunch of rezoning. And when they do the rezoning, they do the necessary preparations to do a lot of that zoning in what we call a by right circumstance. By right means you can build it without being faced with all these significant, shall we say, challenges that can occur along the way. Riverside not too long ago engaged in a bunch of by right stuff, and they've been doing very well in getting a new stuff built. Another great example is, of course, understanding that a lot of folks, they say, look, I don't want our local environment to be damaged. We don't want more sprawl. I agree. The conversation, particularly when you think about a lot of the housing shortage issues, has to be wrapped around multifamily. And you can do multifamily in a lot denser circumstances. By the way, it supports local public transportation. It creates less driving, less commuting. Density is good for the environment. What all regions need to do is find those kind of historic downtown places and get it rezoned for density, pack them into those local, shall we say, economic zones. And again, particularly in the multifamily, a great place to look for that. City of Santa Rosa, a number of years ago in Sonoma, they had the horrible fires, knocked down 4,500 units. In the midst of the wake of that tragedy, they actually got some incredible new incentives put into place to help Santa Rosa's downtown really expand and densify. It took them a little while to get the momentum going. You know, they put it there, it didn't happen, but all of a sudden it's turning on. You're seeing the apartment buildings coming up. And as a result of that, they're breathing new life into that particular economy. Now, I get it. People don't like to see Main Street changed. But one of the things we all have to remember is change is the only constant. And growth, if we try to stand in the way of growth, we create bigger problems for everybody, particularly, of course, for those folks at the very bottom end. If we refuse to allow these kind of changes, the people who are suffering, the people who can least afford to suffer. This is a dramatic thing. And, you know, I got to tell you, I appreciate that you go there. Any city council person on this call right now is like, yeah, good luck getting that change done without every person in my city screaming at me. But again, we have to be out there pushing. The YIMBYs have to be out there screaming and hollering just as much as the NIMBYs. It needs to become a centerpiece of policy at every level.
Do you think with the exercise of the housing element that most jurisdictions are going through, do you think that will show some progress or have an impact?
No, because look, what the state's doing And Tara, you have kids, right?
I do. Two little
Right.
girls.
Yeah, I got two little boys, right? And I read a couple books on this, and I learned that we're never going to whip our kids into being good people, right? And the state wants to whip the cities into being good people. That's exactly what they're doing with these housing elements and all these punishment mechanisms. You're never going to beat the cities into building enough housing. The cities have to take it on for themselves. It has to come locally. Now, the state can give you the tools to make that happen locally, but it has to be a local effort, because as much as the state wants to do, the reality is there's always going to be an ability for the cities to push back. It has to be a local effort. Don't look to Sacramento.
Good point. All policy is local, is what I sort of grew up learning. You've got to really be knocking on the local, elect your locals and make sure that you're also engaged in the civic process. That said, I'm going to look to our chat now and see some of the questions that have come up. Here's one. It says 70% of Gen Z believe that home ownership is out of reach. How true is that? And how will the current economy and housing prices affect that group, or the young people in general, the generations to come forward?
Yeah. Oh, first of all, let me explain to you that every 27-year-old for the last 198 years in the United States has said, I think owning a house is out of reach. It's amazing to me that there are 27-year-olds who think that somehow or other in history, there was a point in time where buying a house at 27 was an easy thing to do. It wasn't. Now, I will be clear that right now, yeah, it's really hard to buy a house. The market's not capitulating because, well, owners are remarkably resistant to take nominal declines, regardless of where interest rates are. And so they won't sell. The net result of that is, yes, at this point in time, trying to get into housing is almost impossible. Interest rates are too high relative to those nominal prices. But, in a few years, that'll burn off and people have opportunities again. It isn't that. It isn't that at all. Now, go the next step. Is it harder to get a house in California than it is in Alabama? Oh, yeah. Why? I, for one, would rather live in California than Alabama. And that ultimately is a sign of our state's, if you will, prosperity. So what do you do about that? Well, again, I hate to go back to this. I'm going to beat that drum one more time. Supply, supply, supply. We don't do it. And it creates a situation where a lot of young people, yeah, they have that choice. If I want to get into housing, I got to either move to Texas or because I'm not going to be able to do it here. Now, will people immediately flee to Texas? Not really. I mean, how many people have gone to New York City and lived in a shoebox, because I want to experience New York City. So it's a choice people will make. I'd rather not have people have to make this choice. And again, we have the ability to do this. We just got to build more housing, and particularly again on the multifamily side. Can't emphasize it enough. Multifamily is where the solutions are.
I'm curious, how does our region's workforce educational level compare with other regions interested in growing higher paying jobs? What more do you think we can do?
Well, I mean, look, it's you have three completely different economies there, right? Santa Cruz is by far and away the skilled economy of the three counties, right? It has a university. It's got a lot of techies who commute up the hill. And as a result of that, it's got a very heavy, high skilled kind of workforce. Higher incomes in the other two places. Monterey is two economies, right? You got Salinas and you got Monterey. It's got Monterey looks like Santa Cruz, whereas Salinas is way more like a Fresno type economy. So in many ways, the structure of the local economy has an impact on, if you will, the structure of that local labor force. What's interesting about Salinas in particular, the city of Salinas, it is by far and away the source of most housing supply growth in the region. They have been remarkably willing to build. But even there, that's kind of a problem. It's almost one of these mismatch issues, right? Because what ends up happening, a lot of people end up having to work and, say, for example, in the city of Monterey, end up having to live in Salinas. And that puts a lot of pressure on the roadways. It's obviously bad for the environment and in many different ways. It's about building more housing, but particularly building more housing relative to where that housing is needed. So, it is a good economy. It's got good skills. It's got some great industries that are up and coming. We know that. But again, the region is going to continue to struggle with the lack of labor force. It's going to create gentrification. You're going to push some traditional industries out. You're going to make it hard for ag to succeed. You got to build enough housing for all.
Well, I mean, tied to housing is, of course, labor. And I know we keep talking about labor shortage. And I know we've often on touched about policies related to that. What can local regions do to increase the labor or make an impact on policy shifts in general?
Yeah, I mean, look, local labor supply is a critical issue, and going beyond the housing conversation, right? I've already beaten that to death. Again, one of the big things is how do you help women continue their careers through having kids? It's a big issue, pre-K education, or it's subsidizing various sorts of preschool and just childcare in general, an incredibly important issue. The participation rate for women in the United States is the lowest in the developed world. And the reason for that very clearly is the lack of subsidies for childcare that our government doesn't put into place. This to me makes a lot more sense than a lot of these other cherished programs they have up in Sacramento right now. You know, they toss money in a lot of places they shouldn't, and as a result of that, they're not tossing enough money at this particular issue. With that in mind, the last thing, and this is something else I said in my presentation, but I'm glad you asked because it's a great way of circling back to this: training. Now more than ever. You know, it's funny because in the past, you know, particularly the WIBs, for example, have always been frustrated, right? They don't feel like they're able to really lean in and help. And then again, goes back to the idea that a lot of the folks you're training still tend to be at the bottom end of that stack of resumes that the local business is flipping through just because of their history or something else. You give the people the training, but it's hard to actually get them into the job. Well, now the opportunities, because of the scarcity of people, helping people get trained, getting into a career path, it completely changes the dynamics of the local economy in so many different ways. And remember, when it comes to capital, investing, machinery, artificial intelligence, although it's not really that, these things all tend to replace low skilled jobs, right? The idea here is by upskilling somebody, by giving them the skills to work with that capital, you help the local economy do more, and you prevent them from, if you will, being displaced by that piece of machinery. Training somebody to use the piece of machinery is the solution to a piece of machinery taking somebody's job.
Well, this kind of takes the machinery aspect of it, kind of reminds me of one of the questions that was raised about your thoughts about the emerging AI technology and how that will affect the job market, job growth, and even for our region here that's mostly ag and hospitality oriented.
Tyler, I missed the first part of that. The comments are coming in so fast. I'm trying to do two things at once.
Yeah, no worries. Which is really great. We have a lot of questions.
There's lots of great comments here, by the way.
Yeah, and I know your time is of the essence here, so we're trying to squeeze in as much.
Yeah.
You were talking about upskilling, all right, and retraining and training folks to use sort of the new machines, the new technology.
Yeah.
That said, you know, AI is like really, you know, top of mind, very heavy. It's in the headlines, etc. With this, with the emerging sort of technologies that we have knocking on our doorstep, how do you think that will impact our region, given that we are largely hospitality and ag focused in San Benito, Monterey counties, especially?
Yeah. Well, again, first of all, artificial intelligence is machine learning. It's not intelligence, right? It's not this epiphany or this massive change in the economy we keep hearing on these ridiculous, miserable stories, these Luddite nonsense we've been dealing with for 1,000 years, right? It's transformative, but only in the way that technology has been transformative over the last, again, the electronics have been transformed in the last 40 or 50 years. So it's not the end of the world. Now, when it comes to these kind of things, actually, technology is really important for ag. It's really important for hotels and tourism. You think about, for example, we understand that the ability to get a room reset for another visitor, it's still pretty much a human prospect. But think of the front folks that are working at the desk and the kind of assistance they can use, or various other processes within the hotel that can be operated with machinery, that can be taken over with software. It's there, believe it or not. And of course, ag's all about figuring out ways of dealing with labor scarcity. Ag in particular, you know, it's clear, particularly over the last few years, just the standard flow of workers that ag needs to come in and help them get things taken off the field, they're not showing up. There are different opportunities, or they're not coming to the United States because of the incredibly negative atmosphere we put on people who would otherwise want to come here. And as a result of that, ag needs this kind of capital deepening more than anything else. And now it's never perfect, right? Now, how do you get a machine to pick a strawberry when it's ripe? That's an
Well,
enormous
especially
technical challenge, but they're getting there. They're trying.
your point, yeah, they are getting there, especially
Yeah.
with specialty crops. And given
Yeah.
that we're with the berry capital of the world and lettuce capital, so these are all real challenges. And with this recent storm in atmospheric rivers, we've taken a major brunt between Santa Cruz and Monterey and San Benito. So a lot top of mind for our region, how we recover, and
Yeah.
what does that look like short term and long term.
Well,
Still, folks are unhoused or in emergency shelters. How long will they stay in hotels?
right. And that's all the more reason that supply's got to come online, right? And these are the kind of opportunities to take advantage of. I know it sounds weird to take advantage of a tragedy, but they say, every tragedy is an opportunity. And this is the time to address some of these housing issues, that these housing insecurity, housing supply issues in this atmosphere. Now you dig in. This is when you have these conversations.
To pivot ever so slightly from housing to commercial real estate.
Yeah.
Should we be worried? We're hearing that that's a challenge, and you've also mentioned, especially the storefronts being empty. What do we do with that? Should we be?
Well, I mean, look, people are buying stuff online. There's no doubt about it. Retail has been shifting gradually for 15 years now. There's nothing particularly new for retail. But to your point, it's clear that traditional retail is not doing so well. I mean, your standard strip mall, not doing well. What do? You've changed it to mixed use. Again, simple rezoning. Take down that one-story retail, put up 3 stories of mixed use, leave the bottom floor retail, put 2 stories of apartments. The beautiful part of that is the stores downstairs have an automatic demand base upstairs, right? It becomes self-reinforcing. It's a great way to accomplish these things. The big shift, of course, has been in office space. And even there, secondary office markets are doing just fine. It's only the big commodity markets that are struggling. And that would include, of course, San Jose and San Francisco. The problems in the West Bay, by the way, are driven by the fact that San Jose expanded its office stock by about 50% in the last decade, which is an insane amount of new space, considering how, well, overall, their labor force hasn't grown all that much, and now we need less office space per employee. So there is too much stock up the hill from you. That's their problem, not yours. It's as simple as that. It's not a global issue. It's a specific issue. The bigger issue is the fact that because people only have to go in 2 or 3 times a week, they may very well look down to the Monterey Bay as a wonderful place to live, since I only have to make the commute up the hill twice a week. Again, these are the large issues. Studying that commute base, what's happening on that, that's going to be a big issue. And tragically, we only have the 2021 American Community Survey, which has that good county-to-county flows in it. When the 22 data comes out later in the year, I would suggest strongly that M3, dive into that data, take a look at what's going on, and get some sense of how tough it's going to be when, again, you're fighting for that scarce housing with folks in San Jose.
Yeah, but to your point earlier about YIMBYs and NIMBYs, a lot of the policy changes, and even looking at that about commute patterns and the selling points, the talking points of the why you could do these little trade-offs, because our regional economies are certainly porous in these tri-county space, but we are also very much impacted by the counties immediately north of us in the Silicon Valley. Is how do we take that, use that as an opportunity and necessarily not as a challenge?
Oh God, I'm sorry, I sound like a broken record. Housing.
Yeah, no, of course, housing. A lot of it is how we socialize it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of it's socializing. It's the talking points of and convincing our neighbors and friends of why the supply has to increase, and in a way that it has to increase. I know you have to. We're rounding out on your time. One last question. We had several come in around the debt ceiling, to go back up to sort of a very macro national level. What real impacts will it have on our region? And especially when you look at the national income, for example, the federal debt, maybe a decade ago was like 33% or so. And now we're looking at nearly 100%. what does that really mean for a region of our size and who we are? Um, or So it's all of those things. Folks are like wondering, like, are we going into a recession? I know you've already touched on this a little bit. The
Yeah.
debt ceiling, given that it's, top of mind, is the headline, nonstop headline, deal, no deal, meeting, no meeting. So I have several questions pinging me right now around the debt ceiling. If you could dive a little bit more into that.
Sure. No, absolutely. It's a great question. Let me back, because there's a bigger thought here, and I think it's worth discussing. Sometimes when I give this conversation, I give my speech, I have people, particularly in the real estate industry, who kind of get upset with me. What do you mean we're not in a recession? We're deep in a recession. And I'm like, well, no, your industry's in a recession. The rest of the economy is doing just fine. And you have falling stock prices. You have obviously some of the issues in the banking sector. Now you have some potential issues in the bond markets. And what we're talking about, of course, is what I've been calling the rich session. The problems in high finance today are creating issues at that top line level. But as I already noted, if you look at Main Street, things are great. Households have tons of cash. They don't have debt constraints. Job opportunities are great. Earnings are going up. The question we have to ask ourselves is how bad does it have to get in high finance before it spills down and really creates chaos on Main Street, right? And the answer is we got a ways to go, even in terms of the debt default. I mean, look, if we get to the point where the federal government runs out of cash, they're not going to default in the debt. They will start doing different things. They'll manipulate, they'll change. It's going to create consternation, probably higher interest rates. But the core demand drivers at that local level, earnings, wealth, and everything else will remain in place and continue to drive the local economy. Right now, I'm not worried about this spillover effect. And candidly, in terms of the debt ceiling, I don't think they're going to blow it up because as soon as grandma doesn't get her Social Security check, trust me, things are going to change, because every constituent's going to be calling their congressperson angry as all get out, and then they'll find a compromise. We should be doing it now. It's tragic that we have to wait for grandma to not get her check before we get angry at these people and what they're doing up there, right? Ultimately, though, and this is the bigger question. Look, Social Security, Medicare, clearly not sustainable. To your point, we have a tremendous amount of debt we built up over the last couple of years, with more to come. The reality is we have a $1 trillion structural deficit at the federal level, which is not sustainable. The federal government needs to cut spending and increase taxes. It's as simple as that. We need to have some fiscal responsibility. But they're not going to become fiscally responsible until we tell them they have to. Remember, ultimately, if the folks in City Hall, if the folks in the state capitol, if the folks in Washington, D.C. aren't focusing on the problems you think they should be focusing on, remember, that's because of you. We have to be involved. We have to be involved either directly by participating, by talking, by being there, or candidly by supporting the groups that can do the talking for us, whether it's M3, various sorts of chambers, and so on and so forth. We have to make sure our voice is heard, because if we're not doing that, somebody else is, and you don't know who that somebody else is and whether or not they're going to be pushing forward the right things. It's about narratives.
About narratives. Well, on that point, thank you so much, Dr. Thornberg, for being with us again this year. Monterey Bay Economic Partnership thanks you for that. And I thank you for rounding out that we have to be engaged. So MBEP, we're constantly encouraging our community to be engaged, to become members, and operating at the intersection of business, government, and community. So thank you for uplifting that, because it is our engagement at the end of the day, and changing those narratives and advocating. And MBEP hopes to do that, continues to do that. So thank you again for your time, and we will see you hopefully soon.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.